at the beginning of the year was that it is a worldwide problem that plagues many countries on different levels. What I first want to talk about is the definition of poverty, mainly because there are many misconceptions and assumptions about poverty that are flat out wrong. First off, poverty is the state or condition of having little or no money, goods, or means of support. As we all know, poverty is a very broad topic, so I will try to make it as least complicated and understandable as possible. There are two kinds of poverty, absolute and relative. Absolute poverty refers to the deprivation of basic human needs, which commonly include food, water, shelter, sanitation, clothing, healthcare, and education. Relative poverty is defined as economic inequality in the location or society in which one lives. My first current event issue that connected to my main topic, poverty, was focused on poverty, specifically in the U.S. I used an article from the New York Times that was called "Poverty in America is Mainstream." My article talks about the misconceptions pertaining to poverty in the U.S. and how many of these persuasive assumptions are just wrong. The amount of people that experience poverty is extremely high. Nearly 40% of Americans between the ages of 25 and 60 will experience at least 1 year below the official poverty line sometime in that period. Furthermore, more than half of American children will at some time in their life reside in a household where food stamps are used. There is a standard image people see when they think poor. Usually it is of a burdened underclass that has been living this way for a matter of years. Surprisingly, people in the U.S. experience poverty relatively a short time. So basically, the average time most people spend in poverty in the U.S. is relatively short. More than 1 in 7 people in the United States live below the poverty line, which is $22,113 for a family of 4 in 2010. More than 1 in 5 children in the United States live below the poverty line. Nationally, more than 44% of children live in low-income working families. Most Americans will live in poverty at some point before age 65. A person working full-time at the minimum wage earns about $14,500 a year. The official poverty line for a family of 3, 1 parent, 2 children, is $17,568. The United States determines the official poverty rate using poverty thresholds that are issued each year by the Census Bureau. Although millions of people are poor today, we have initiated many effective methods that have worked. From Social Security to food stamps to the Earned Income Tax Credit and on, we have enacted programs that now keep 40 million people out of poverty. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, poverty would have been nearly double than it is now if it weren't for those measures. There are tons of additional ways to reduce poverty. Some include making the rich pay their fair share of running the country and raise the minimum wage. Realistically speaking, the main challenge here is keeping what we now have put into effect. It's uncertain that things will stay as good as they are. The new generation of young people is ripe for a new politics of honesty. Lower income people will participate if there are candidates who speak to their situation. The people have the power if they use it correctly. Ultimately, helping the poor should be America's #1 priority. There are many ways for you to contribute to help U.S. poverty. Though your actions may not dramatically change the rate of poverty, you will be helping a family in need, even possibly saving a person's life.
The picture on the top shows the Great Depression of the 1930s. The Great Depression spread poverty throughout the U.S. Hungry, unemployed Americans stood in long bread lines to receive food paid for by charitable donations. The hard times dragged on until 1942, after the U.S. entered World War II. The picture on the bottom shows the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution brought poverty to many British people. Soup kitchens, such as the one in East London in 1867, helped feed many desperately poor workers. The picture on the top shows a South Asian farmer getting advice from a government farm expert. In an effort to reduce the widespread poverty that exists in their countries, South Asian governments try to teach farmers about new seeds and fertilizers and improved agricultural methods. This scene is in India, South Asia's largest country. The picture on the bottom shows the Dawes Act of 1887 broke up American Indian tribal lands in the United States into small property units. Lands that remained after all the Indians had received their shares were sold to whites, thereby freeing more land for white settlement. Through the Dawes Act, the government hoped to encourage Indians to become farmers and to assimilate into non-Indian society. However, many Indians eventually lost all their land and sank into poverty. The first page of the Dawes Act is shown here. So, what are the causes of poverty?
Structural adjustment. This is a major cause of poverty because developing nations are in debt and poverty, partly due to international institutions, the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. For years, these programs have been heavily criticized for resulting in poverty. In addition, for developing or third world countries, there has been an increased dependency on the richer nations. This is despite the IMF and World Bank's claim that they will reduce poverty. Structural adjustment policies, otherwise known as SAPs, have been imposed to ensure economic restructuring and debt repayment. But the way it has been happening has required poor countries to reduce spending on important things, like health, education, and development, while debt repayment and other economic policies have been making the priority. In effect, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have demanded that poor nations lower the standard of living for their people, which is utterly horrible because the standard of living is already extremely low. Hunger. Hunger and poverty go hand in hand. Poverty is a cause of hunger, and hunger is a cause of poverty. By causing poor health, low levels of energy, and even mental impairment, hunger can lead to even greater poverty by reducing people's ability to work and learn, thus leading to even greater hunger. Climate change. Climate change is increasingly viewed as a current and future cause of hunger and poverty. Increasing drought, flooding, and changing climate patterns requiring a shift in crops and farming practices may not be easily accomplished are three key issues. Harmful economic systems. In my opinion, the principal underlying cause of poverty is the ordinary operation of the economic and political systems in the world. Essentially, control over resources and income is based on military, political, and economic power that typically ends up in the hands of a minority who live well, while those at the bottom barely survive. My second current event issue focused primarily on extreme poverty. Extreme poverty, otherwise known as absolute poverty, is stated as a condition characterized by severe deprivation of basic human needs. More than 1 billion people, 1/6 of the world's population, live in extreme poverty on less than $1 a day. The top 10 poorest countries include Afghanistan, Madagascar, Malawi, Niger, the Central African Republic, Eritrea, Liberia, Burundi, Zimbabwe, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. When talking about extreme global poverty, you need to consider the following. 3.4 million people die every day from water-related diseases around the world, and roughly 768 million people do not have access to clean water. Nearly 11,000 people die every day from HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Close to 2/3 of these people are living in sub-Saharan Africa. 57 million children of primary school age are out of school. More than half of them are in sub-Saharan Africa and a further 1/5 in South and West Asia. A woman dies every minute due to complications during pregnancy and childbirth. Worldwide, it's estimated that 29.8 million people are enslaved. Malnutrition is the underlying cause of death for at least 3.1 million children, accounting for 45% of all deaths among children under the age of 5. At the core, a strategy to combat poverty requires economic growth while allowing the poor to contribute to the economic growth. A World Bank study of 19 poor countries concluded that every 1% increase in national income per head translates into a 1.3% fall in extreme poverty, hence the importance of the state of the world economy. There are two programs in particular that offer the most hope for combating poverty. Microfinance are financial services for the poor that have successfully provided funding to impoverished people in some countries. In addition, poverty alleviation has gone hand in hand with improvements in basic services. Digging canals and building water treatment plants has increased the number of people with access to safe water. In South Asia, for instance, the number of those without clean water has been nearly halved since 1990. Thanks to this and to better public health provisions, the rate at which people die from infectious diseases such as malaria and tuberculosis is falling in most poor countries.
The president of the World Bank, Jim Yong Kim, spoke at a news conference in April of 2013 in Washington, announcing that the World Bank has set a goal of eliminating extreme poverty by 2030. He says, "We have set an expiration date. With commitment, cooperation, and the vision of leaders from all around the world, we have great faith that we can make it happen." The bank defines extreme poverty as living on less than $1.25 per day. It is estimated that there are still 1.2 billion people living in extreme poverty, with sub-Saharan Africa accounting for more than one-third of the world's extreme poor. Christine Lagarde, managing director of the International Monetary Fund, also known as the IMF, said lending facilities to low-income countries were being improved, and she pledged increased and more focused support for small states. The spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank on Saturday followed 2 days of discussions among finance leaders of the group of 20 nations, composed of traditional powers such as the US, Japan, and Germany, and fast-growing developing nations such as China, Brazil, and India. This is a world poverty map that shows the Millennium Developmental Goal number 1, which is to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. These goals call for reducing the proportion of people living on less than $1 a day to half the 1990 level by 2015, from 28.3% of all people in low and middle income economies to 14.2%. The goals also call for halving the proportion of people who suffer from hunger between 1990 and 2015.
According to the World Bank, the developing world has already attained the Millennium Development Goal target to cut the 1990 poverty rate in half by 2015. The 1990 extreme poverty rate, $1.25 a day in 2005 prices, was halved in 2010, according to estimates. According to these estimates, 21% of people in the developing world lived at or below $1.25 a day. That's down from 43% in 1990 and 52% in 1981. This means that 1.22 billion people lived on less than $1.25 a day in 2010, compared with 1.91 billion in 1990 and 1.94 billion in 1981. Notwithstanding this achievement, even if the current rate of progress is to be maintained, some 1 billion people will still live in extreme poverty in 2015, and progress has been slower at higher poverty lines. In all, 2.4 billion people lived on less than $2 a day in 2010, the average poverty line in developing countries and another common measurement of deep deprivation. That is only a slight decline from 2.59 billion in 1981. In some developing countries, we continue to see a wide gap, or in some cases, widening gap between rich and poor, and between those who can and cannot access opportunities. It means that access to good schools, healthcare, electricity, safe water, and other critical services remains elusive for many people who live in growing economies. Other challenges, such as economic shocks, food insecurity, and climate change, which was one of the causes of poverty, threaten to undermine the progress made in recent years.